Meet Tiffany. Tiffany has a pest problem in her home and calls Advantage Pest Control to help. She was able to book a service as early as the next business day to complete a treatment. They are environmentally conscious, with a record of safe, quality procedures. They take care of all pests endangering her space, such as roaches, bedbugs, mice, rats, and more. Tiffany is relieved to know that Advantage Pest Control offers prevention methods that are effective, cost-efficient, and present little to no risk to people and the environment. She is happy to know that all their technicians are fully licensed by the Ministry of the Environment, insured, and are proud members of several leading pest control organizations, certifying that our technicians get the job done professionally every time. Advantage utilizes a dynamic integrated pest management when controlling pests in homes or businesses, and offers a guarantee period for specific pest. Call Advantage today for a free quote at 877-504-BUGS.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Don Neufeld. I'm the Vice President of Sales at Coinamatic, who is proud to support this seminar. Industry updates, changes and impacts for rental property owners and managers. It's my pleasure to open today's session. A little about Coinamatic before we start. Coinamatic has provided laundry solutions to the multi-housing sector for 75 years. This year, we're in the midst of a digital transformation, and we're excited to introduce the latest advancements in digital payment solutions, equipment, and service technologies as with connected laundry rooms. These advances bring real-time information and support through live portals to assist you and your customers, and we'd like you to visit our virtual booth for more information. Now, before we get started, I'd like to remind you to get comfortable and settle into your seat. Please use the chat function to connect with people in the session. The pandemic continues to provide operational and business challenges for the rental housing providers across the province. As operators continue to follow legislative changes, this session will highlight the impact on operations, shifts in advocacy, and look ahead to an economic recovery as the vaccines are rolled out throughout the year. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, let's begin our session.
Good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our session providing an industry update in the purpose-built rental industry. Welcome and thank you all for joining us. I am joined by three colleagues today. FRPO colleagues, Ted Whitehead, Director of Certification at FRPO, Asquith Allen, Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs, and from Strategy Corp, John Matheson, who is a principal. We're just going to get right into our slides. Thank you to my colleagues for joining, and you're going to be hearing from all of them as we proceed through our presentation today. So on to our, just a quick introduction of our, sorry, hold on a second. I think I may have gone ahead too quickly. Just quickly, a little bit of a further introduction of my colleagues. As I say, just their pictures and titles, as I've said, are there. Asquith Allen has been at FRPO for a few years now and works on the policy and regulatory affairs side, all of the work we do with government to understand regulations and how they impact our members. Ted Whitehead, who is a longtime FRPO team member, director of certification, get into more about the Certified Rental Building program that he runs, and John Matheson, who has worked around government and public policy for many years, has helped FRPO advocate for public policy outcomes that support a viable rental housing industry. So really pleased to be joined by all three of you fine fellows today. We'll get right into our presentation and want to just provide sort of a quick or sort of just a brief background about FRPO, about who we are. So FRPO represents more than 2,200 members who own, manage, build, and finance over 350,000 rental homes across Ontario. We are committed to delivering quality experience and services for our residents. FRPO's Certified Rental Building program requires buildings and property management staff be certified and trained to meet over 50 best practice standards. Tenant engagement is a key component of this program, and the CRB certification is a guarantee that the rental housing provider cares about the quality of their building and the service provided. So FRPO is the largest organization that advocating for quality rental housing in the province of Ontario and has been in existence since 1985. A few other points about the economic impact that we make as an industry in the Ontario economy. The private rental housing sector in Ontario generates over 146,000 full-time jobs with an average wage of $56,600 in positions such as property management, administration, and repair, contributes $7 billion in taxes to all levels of government, and contributes $18.3 billion annually to Ontario's GDP. We're looking to actually update this study or this information later this year after the census that will be completed, I believe this later this spring is done, and so we'll see, we'll have that information to update, but certainly a significant impact to Ontario's GDP from our sector. Want to just get in, provide a bit of a government relations update as the biggest mandate of FRPO is to advocate on behalf of our members to government, and so that is a very significant sort of mandate and function within the organization. Just go to the next slide. Over the past year, FRPO has been actively defending our members' interests during what's obviously been an extremely challenging period for rental housing providers, for our residents, and in fact for all Ontarians, as we have been coping with the COVID-19 pandemic. So what specifically have we been working on related to government relations? We have ensured that the rent freeze that was brought forward in August of last year for this year, for 2021, that it was temporary and that it required legislative approval to be extended. We opposed a legal challenge also last summer to extend the eviction moratorium. We were successful in that work, in that the eviction moratorium that had been put in place during the first lockdown and was lifted, that did in fact go forward and was not put back in place at that time. And then we encouraged government to keep the Landlord-Tenant Board open for hearings and orders. And as we've had subsequent stay-at-home orders, and there have been, as including right now, the period that we're in right now, there was a pause on enforcement of residential evictions. We've been successful at in conversations with government to in making the case that the Landlord-Tenant Board should remain open for hearings and for orders. It's extremely important to access to justice that happen, and that's government has in fact done that. Current status: we are at the time of this taping, we were in an emergency break when these slides were put together, but just within the last 24 hours, that of course has been changed to now being in another state of emergency and stay-at-home order for 28 days, and so we are all just sort of I think grappling with that, and that means that we are continuing to work with our residents as we have been for the past 13 months to ensure that we are keeping our buildings safe and clean, and obviously sharing as much information as we can with our residents, obviously encouraging them to reach out if they have difficulties, but really heeding the advice of our political leaders as we continue to work together to try to get through this crisis. And I think obviously we all hope that this third lockdown will be our last, and that we'll be able to start talking about recovery and moving past COVID. Supply remains a concern with our industry. We before COVID-19 struck, it was a major topic of conversation with us and the Ontario government. We have in this government one that was and I think still is concerned about supply of housing. And while it's been obviously not the primary focus while we're over the last year, it is going to come back as an important issue. We know immigration targets are still have been put back in place, and we'll hear more about that a little later. But as immigration returns, as international students return, there will be a renewed deficit in housing. Obviously, rental is a big part of the solution for providing housing for people, and so we continue to sort of advocate. And I think again, as we move through the next hopefully few months and get to a better place for everyone, those conversations I expect will resume. And we will continue to advocate for policy solutions that prioritize and incent construction of purpose-built rental that continue to address issues of time, what I think reasonable people would agree is unreasonable length of time it takes to get applications approved, and the costs related to that. Trying to continue to make improvements. This government has made improvements through More Homes, More Choice Act, but it is a complex issue, as we all know, and there's always more that can be done, and so we'll continue to advocate for that, so that we can get shovels in the ground and get more purpose-built rental built in this province. And just the last a few other points that are, I know, important for many in this sector. And so we just in terms of the we know there's a rent freeze currently in place, and as we continue to move through 2021 and get to 2022, in a few months, July is when typically the rent increase is announced for the following year. Where we certainly oppose any further extension to a rent freeze. We are currently working to ensure that the guideline comes in as planned, and it's of course a calculation that's used in the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing that determines what that increase would be, and certainly it is our view that that should go forward. It's in fact, we have a freeze right now, and for 2021 and in 2020. For most of that year, rents did not go up even before there was a mandate to not be able to do that. Rental housing providers understood the circumstances that many people were in and were not raising rents. So wanting to be able to, so understanding that, we really think it's important to be able to, for rental housing providers to be able to, have the guideline as is needed to maintain buildings and is needed to be able to carry on the work that's necessary. Rent arrears is an issue that has received some attention as well, and FRPO has called for a rent assistance program for the most vulnerable and those who have been the most severely economically impacted by the pandemic. That as each month passes, the amount of arrears for some residents, of course, is growing, and the difficulties that presents to some rental housing providers is growing as they continue to have mortgage payments to meet, increased utility bills to pay, other maintenance expenses that are going up. It is becoming an increasingly challenging on both sides. So that's something that government is interested in, and we continue to have conversations about how we can reasonably and fairly address that situation going forward. And in LTP operations, we continue to speak about the need to keep LTP open. As I said, that is still the case today, and we would oppose any actions that would suspend operations at the Landlord Tenant Board. And while we know that enforcement of orders has been suspended right now, certainly our message to government is that, and I think it's a message that has been received, is that this is a temporary situation, and that hopefully after 28 days this will end in terms of the current state of emergency, and enforcement of evictions will resume in the province. That's certainly what we are advocating for, and hope will be the case. At this point in the presentation, I'm going to turn it over to Asquith Allen, FRPO Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs, who has some additional updates that he's going to provide. Asquith, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tony, and a pleasure to be a part of the panel. So getting right into things on the planning side, it's definitely been an interesting year and an interesting couple of years in the rental space. Obviously, with some cornerstone legislation from the government in Bill 108, and in particular some updates and changes to that legislation that we saw last summer in Bill 197 around COVID economic, or labeled around COVID economic recovery. So the key piece that I definitely wanted to make mention for those watching today is the new community benefits charge framework. And so obviously, just as a quick reminder, Bill 108 sort of was repackaging some of the services that you would have seen in the discounted services framework, where municipalities can write up a bylaw for services not included in the listed services of the Development Charges Act, and then apply a 10% discount and charge the rest to the developer per door. And so what they were looking to do at that point is to create this new community benefits charge for those discounted services to really get a handle on the percentage and the expected cost that our members, our building members, would be paying per door. And so initially they were looking at, as you can see here on the one side of the slide, 15% of land value, and that would be split between the lower and upper tier municipalities if those existed in the jurisdiction in which you're looking to build. And they would encompass a number of services that would be eligible for all developments. And fast track to Bill 197, which came out last summer. The CBC has changed such that it is a straight charge of up to 4% on the land value. However, there was change to eligibility, and so going forward, only developments that are 10 or more units and 5 or more stories would be captured under the charge, and so that is clearly intended to be applied to high-rise development, obviously for condos and rental buildings. Moving on to the next slide, just so folks get a bit of a sense. So this is, or 1 through 21, I believe here, is the full list of development charges, or the eligible services to which development charge revenues can be paid, currently in Section 2, Sub 4 of the Act, which was passed with Bill 197. But this slide sort of breaks down for you how that's come to be over the last 2 years. So when Bill 108 came out, the green portion on this slide was the sum total of the listed, what we call hard DCs in the DCs Act. And so the plan was, and partially executed in February of 2020, when the government came out with the CBC framework to create the charge and decide what services municipalities could add to their bylaws to help pay for these increased costs, would be in the yellow section. So things like long-term care, the not parkland, or the money to actually purchase parkland, but the maintenance of that and the service costs of that. Things like public health, some of the things you would have seen in the discounted services framework were to be thrown into that CBC and kept as a reg that can be changed a lot more easily than it would if it were in the actual DCs Act. And so what has happened now is that a change was made with Bill 197 to include everything that you see on this list 1 through 21 in the green, the yellow, and the blue into the new DCs Act to be applied to developments. And so it's definitely interesting in terms of, obviously the timing of the legislation and what's actually now included. You could see things here like number 17, housing services, near the bottom there, number 19, services related to emergency preparedness. There are definitely some members who are of the view that, municipalities are asking developers, or may ask developers, to essentially pay for the next pandemic, all sort of under this sort of growth, the growth pays for growth principle. And so we've definitely been advocating with some help from our members who do build, providing some great data, and Altus Group, who we definitely leaned on last summer to go into government specifically around this community benefits charge to say, look, our members are going to be paying a bit more, and folks generally in the industry are going to be paying more, especially in the short term. There are definitely impacts for those who are building in communities that historically didn't use Section 37, who might now feel incentivized to collect these additional revenues that they weren't before. And so the public policy angle to all of this is that a 4% CBC over time would incentivize municipalities to upzone their jurisdictions such that they can collect more revenues, obviously with higher densities in mind. And our argument to government on behalf of the entire industry has been quite simple, and it's that nowadays, with average market rent, with pre-pandemic demand pressure, we believe returning once we are out of the pandemic, that time doesn't necessarily exist, and we're definitely going to see some increased tightness, so to speak, in the market going forward. Just a quick piece on immigration, sort of leading from that, the piece around pre-pandemic demand pressure definitely coming back in full force once we're through this rough patch of COVID-19. The number there, especially for Ontario, that's important. 341,180 permanent residents in Canada landing. Of that number, 153,395, as you can see on the left side, 44%, so almost half, are landing in Ontario. And so that's definitely important for government to keep in mind as you go through planning and development changes going forward. And the trends over the last number of years have bared out around the same percentages you're seeing here. Around half of the folks who land in Canada do choose Ontario, and they're not living in home ownership, right? They're definitely renting as their housing of first choice, not really choice, but real necessity. And so we do have to prepare for those folks who are coming. The economic permanent residents, definitely an interesting piece also at 54% of our permanent resident landings. Definitely the government has been on track and has been promoting the merits of economic immigration. It is my belief definitely that coming out of the pandemic, economic immigration is going to be not necessarily a singular magic bullet, but definitely a tool that the federal government will use to help attract and bring people to Canada that can help spur the economy in certain sectors as we emerge from this. To be able to generate increased economic productivity in the country, but that would also mean increased tax revenues for government. And then just the chart there just shows you some of the planned highs in terms of the low and high range for different subsets of the permanent resident framework. You can see there for the economic skilled and economic business sections, either coming close to in the business side or on the skills side surpassing the actual planned high. The total immigration or the PR piece at 350,000, we're definitely coming in close to what is planned for Ontario. And going forward, the government has definitely set out targets that are over and above $400,000 people year over year, and they definitely plan on rolling over the numbers that they do not hit into future years to be able to get those immigrants into the country and working as soon as possible. So definitely economic immigration is on the brain, I believe, at the federal level, and it will have very meaningful impacts on the rental housing sector. Last but not least, good old landlord-tenant board. And we'll see how long I keep my job after this piece, but definitely the landlord and tenant board has improved from this time last year. Frankly, this time last year the landlord and tenant board wasn't open to be hearing hearings and applications. So definitely we're in a better space. Through the grapevine, we are hearing that it's around 15,000-ish active L1 applications at the board as of around the end of January. And so, the Landlord and Tenant Board generally has an annual report that talks about the fiscal year of government, which would end at the end of March. And so with only 2 months left into that fiscal year and only having around 15,000 active L1 applications, when in a typical year we're looking at mid to high 40s, right? Being down 2/3 definitely shows, in the equation that I like to talk about, lower LTP applications plus increased arrears, both as a percentage of units in our ecosystem and in a percentage of rent collected, because rent collection definitely has been down during the pandemic. Those two things equal landlords and tenants working together to settle arrears, to do away with arrears, or to just avoid going to the board in the first place, looking to work things out without some of those putting some of those formal processes in place. So definitely to the folks watching and those who aren't watching, you've been doing some great work to keep that number in and around what it is, and definitely you should be credited for it. On that note, it's really important to make the distinction between a residential eviction moratorium and an enforcement suspension. A moratorium is what took place between mid-March and the end of July of last year here in Ontario, where the board was not open to hear a lot of applications or issue orders, only on an urgent basis. What we have now is an enforcement suspension. So the LTB is open to receive applications, to hold hearings, and to issue orders. It is in the times where the provincial government, through the Emergency Management Civil Protection Act, issues a stay-at-home order, that there is a regulation appended to that suspends just the enforcement of those orders that you have received at the board. So a lot of the processes are still ongoing for those tenants where the really only option for you, based on your own business and your own situations, is to proceed with applications. But that route was open in that sort of January stay-at-home order, is open now, and it's only the enforcement of evictions, at least for the next 28 days, that has been suspended. In terms of other improvements coming to the board, there's definitely a move to Zoom from Microsoft Teams. Definitely have heard from our members and just anecdotally from a couple of folks that I talk to who do rent units, that there is definitely an issue with Teams and just its functionality and its stability as a system to be able to do what the board, or match what the board normally does at in-person hearings and in its in-person processes. And so moving to Zoom is very important, also because they'll be able, from what we've heard from folks at the board, to set up a bit of a concierge service such that the actual adjudicator at the board isn't somewhat of a bouncer, so to speak, or a concierge, where they're saying who's here, who's not taking attendance. There's going to be a person sort of at the front desk of Zoom when you log into a hearing to actually move you into the right rooms, to actually set up breakout rooms in Zoom when you're going through mediation, when if a tenant needs to talk to duty counsel and some of those processes. So the adjudicators are not so much focused on the administrative side of things in getting to the actual meat of the issues related to the hearing, but delving straight into that right away and sort of getting down to brass tacks, which is part of the board improving its process and getting to sort of that 4 to 6 week time frame that is sort of the ideal goal in terms of their operations. Last but not least is the Ontario Justice Accelerated Strategy that came out not too long ago. It is a $28.5 million commitment from the Ontario government. And so one of the first things that will happen in around the late summer of this year is that there will be a new case management, document sharing and document management, and online dispute resolution tool that will be coming forward. And the Landlord and Tenant Board is one of the first tribunals within Tribunals Ontario to use that software. So definitely interested to see how sort of the virtual mediation and virtual online dispute resolution will help in terms of the Landlord and Tenant Board managing its own caseload and potentially getting rid of certain cases where folks appear and it's a 5-minute hearing and it gets adjourned to another time. Definitely can see some improvements coming forward there. So that's been my update on sort of the planning framework and some of the operating framework. And I believe I'm throwing it over now to Ted.
Thank you, Asquith. So my topic today, first of all, many thanks to Tony for allowing me to be on the agenda for FRPO's update for Springfest. It's always a pleasure to come, and I think I've got some interesting analysis to talk today. So we're going to talk about municipal licensing, and in particular, the Toronto Rent Safe program, and just take a look at it from a different perspective, and I call it looking at the facts. There may be a few of you in the audience today that will recall I represented FRPO and vigorously opposed the City of Toronto initiative to license the multi-res industry in 2016. Regretfully, FRPO's efforts and that of our many industry colleagues were unsuccessful as the politicians won the day and the City of Toronto introduced its Rent Safe program in July of 2017. It has now been nearly 4 years since Rent Safe was introduced. It is often being heralded by a number of Ontario and Canadian municipalities and various politicians as a licensing program example to adopt in their communities. But really, is it? Has it really made a difference? Let's look at the facts. John, I believe you're going to do my changing of slides. Thank you very much. Rent Safe came into effect, as I mentioned, July 2017, and it combines the requirements of a then and newly created bylaw, Municipal Code Chapter 354, now called apartment buildings, and the existing regulatory audit and enforcement systems, in particular Municipal Bylaw 629. It is, in fact, a registration and licensing program for purpose-built, multi-resident apartment buildings, 3 stories or more, 10 or plus units. Under this program, owners must pay an annual fee of just around $11.25 per unit, at least for last year. New pricing for 2021 has yet to be announced. The City of Toronto itself, one of the largest landlords in all of Canada, waived fees for social housing providers, including all of its own Toronto Community Housing Corporation buildings. This regretfully unfairly burdened the private sector with the majority of the costs for the Rent Safe program. The underlying assumptions and messaging around Rent Safe TO program promoted a view that privately owned and managed rental housing stock in Toronto was and is in a poor state of repair and neglect. And as a result, the private industry requires significant oversight and regulation to keep landlords in line and to protect tenants. Regardless of the actual effectiveness of the Rent Safe TO program and its real impact on maintenance standards within the multi-res apartment building industry or apartment buildings in Toronto, and other municipalities across the province and beyond are eyeing the Rent Safe regulatory and registration licensing regime as a viable approach in their communities. Next slide, John. Oh, one ahead, sorry. Back. Okay, John, can we go back? There, one back, please. There's the one we're looking for. Buoyed by the perceived success of programs like Rent Safe TO and the continued pressure from tenant advocacy groups across the province, the topic of landlord licensing is now on the political agenda in many communities. Now let's take a look at what the data from Rent Safe TO actually shows. Next. Before I get started, the data used for this analysis purpose was extracted from the open sharing database from Rent Safe TO itself and the city's MLS database. Now let's begin to take a look at the latest Rent Safe data and see what it tells us. In total, there are 3,462 buildings, 3 stories and 10 units or more registered in the program. Private sector accounts for the largest segment with over 83% of the buildings. Next. Let's look at the rent-safe registration data by age of buildings and property type. The private sector has the oldest buildings in the rent-safe TO program, with the bulk of them being built in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The average year when private sector buildings were built is 1959, whereas TCHC buildings are on average 17 years newer than private sector buildings, having an average age of 1976. An important point to note that is in the last 40 years, in a rapidly growing city of Toronto, only 406 purpose-built rental buildings were constructed, and the private sector only contributed 106 of them. Now let's look at the rent-safe registration data by building and property type. A look at the Toronto skyline provides an impression that Toronto is a city of high-rise buildings. The reality is, more than half of the buildings in the rent-safe TO program are considered to be low-rise buildings, 5 stories or under. Only 22% of total buildings in rent-safe are considered high-rises. TCHC has the highest portfolio proportion of high-rise buildings, while the private sector has the highest portfolio proportion of low-rise buildings. And finally, high-rise buildings account for just over half, 55%, of the 315,379 apartment units covered under rent-safe TO. Now let's look at the rent-safe data employing their latest scoring results. A total of 16% of private sector buildings and just under 19% of social housing buildings scored 86 or better on their building evaluations. In comparison, only 5.3% of TCHC buildings had evaluation scores in the 86 plus range. Yet remember, and I think it's important to point out, TCHC buildings are 17 years newer on average than private sector buildings. TCHC buildings have the highest proportion of buildings scoring 65 or less on the rent-safe TO evaluation, a total of 17%. This compares to only 8.4% for social housing and 11.3% for the private sector. Now, let's look at the rent-safe TO data by score category, by size, and by property type. Data shows that low-rise buildings have the lowest average evaluation scores, around about 74% across all property types. On the other hand, high-rise buildings are on average significantly higher, with average evaluation scores in the 79% range. It's important, or it is also interesting to note, of the 765 high-rise multi-res apartment buildings in the city, over 81% are owned and managed by the private sector. The average rent-safe scores for private sector high-rise buildings is over 80%. This would seemingly indicate that, in fact, the private sector is doing a pretty good job at meeting the city's property and maintenance-related standards. Next. Now let's look at the rent-safe TO data by age of building and property type. When we examine the data, it is evident that across sectors, efforts have been made to upgrade and maintain the oldest buildings in the rent-safe TO program. The 328 private sector buildings built prior to 1940 had average scores of 71 and 72%. These scores reflect the upgrades and regular maintenance that obviously was required and that has in fact been completed for buildings of this vintage. This chart also shows that the lowest scoring buildings are TCH buildings between 1940 and 1970. These buildings consistently score between 63 and 69%. As one might expect, the newest buildings have the highest evaluation scores. However, evaluation scores for post-2000 private sector buildings are significantly higher than for social housing and TCH buildings of the same size. This may be in part due to the belief that limited maintenance and capital dollars should go to older buildings, as newer buildings do not need as much care and attention. The findings seem to indicate that newer social housing and TCHC buildings are not being as well maintained as the private sector, and thereby may potentially fall into a state of disrepair earlier than necessary in the future. For all the criticism labeled at the private sector that they are not maintaining buildings adequately, the rent-safe data clearly shows this is not the case. One can only ponder why many politicians take the broad brush focus on the private sector as the problem, rather than a more directed approach at where the problem really lies, including at TCHC. Now, let's take a look at the rent-safe data over 2 time periods by property type to determine what its impact has been. Note that the 2 periods in question cover a period of 18 months. Between the published March 20 data and the published March-December 20 data, there has been really a limited increase in the average evaluation scores achieved by buildings registered in the rent-safe program. Private sector buildings achieved the largest increase at 3.9%, whereas TCHC buildings achieved the lowest increase in scores at just 1.4%. Overall, reported evaluation scores increased by just 3.6%, and largely because of the private sector proportion. I think it is noteworthy that the statistical change in evaluation scores between the 2 time periods is relatively small. Given the only marginal increases in evaluation scores over this 18-month time frame, it does cause one to wonder and to pause and question, are stakeholders really receiving value for their money, given the cost of maintaining and running the rate-safe TO program and the added bureaucracy it imposed on rental housing providers? Now to the next stuff. Next, John, please. What really makes the analysis of the rent-safe TO program both interesting and perplexing at the same time is when you compare the rent-safe TO data with the data from the Municipal Licensing and Standards Investigations database. The MLS database captures investigations, notices, and orders related to bylaw enforcement activity within the City of Toronto by MLNS, and can be used in part to understand the level and types of issues and compliance with meeting various bylaw requirements. If there is a high degree of non-compliance with property standards and bylaws, and really poorly maintained buildings, one would expect to see a large volume of investigations, notices, and orders related to rent-safe TO buildings. Let's take a look. A comparison between rent-safe TO data and MLS data shows that only 73% of buildings are included from the rent safety program, and also were identified in the MLS database. In other words, 27% of buildings had no issues at all. TCHC had the highest proportions of their buildings included in the MSL database at 83%. Next. Now let's look at the MLS investigations, notices, and orders for registered rent-safe buildings. Over a 2-year period, out of a total of 100,965 investigations, notices, and orders identified in the MLS database, less than 17% of them were attributed to rent-safe buildings. In other words, Over 83% of the MLS investigations, notices, and orders are related to non-rent safe buildings. It is important to also note that only 9.8% of total orders and notices issued by the MSLA staff related to rent-safe buildings, implying, by the way, that over 91% were again issued to non-rent safe TO buildings. With a large portion of investigations and notices and orders at 83% relating to non-rent safe buildings, it does call into question the current focus of the Rent Safe program. If addressing maintenance and other issues is a goal of the Rent Safe TO program, it certainly appears that this program is not clearly focused on the buildings where the vast majority of issues lie. We have just seen now, next, John, thank you. I think back maybe one, John, sorry. No, back. I think you're just a bit ahead of me. There we go. I think that's what we're looking for. No, should be slide 16, John, one back. We have just seen that only 17% of rent-safe TO buildings are also identified in the MLS database. This chart also shows that only about 18% of all investigations identified in the Municipal Licensing and Standards Investigation Activity databases relate to addresses identified in the Rent Safe TO database. While investigations relating to property standards are the most frequent type of investigation for Rent Safe TO buildings, these investigations make up only 31% of all MLS property standard investigations. The remaining 68% of MLS property standard investigations are for, once again, non-rent safe buildings. Again, one can conclude, is the Rent Safe TO program truly focused on the right sector and where the problems lie? Next. Should be one more ahead, John, I think. There we go. I think that's it. Should be slide 17 for what it's worth. On a final look at the data, our final look at the data examines Rent Safe TO's evaluation scores versus the average number of MSL investigation notices and orders per building. First of all, it confirms poorly maintained buildings that scored badly in Rent Safe TO certainly have, as you might suspect, the largest number of investigation and notices and orders per building as represented in the MSL database. This data show us that buildings scoring 50 or lower have on average over 35 investigation orders and notices per building. However, where it gets interesting is when you look at the data for buildings that scored 50 and better. There is not significant differences in the Rent Safe TO evaluation scores and the number of investigations, notices, and orders for rent safe buildings. For example, building scoring 86 or better averaged only 5.3 investigations, notices, and orders per building, whereas building scoring 66 to 85 scored just marginally a little bit more, 6.1. And even building scoring just above 50, i.e. between the 51 and 65, only had an average of 9.7 investigation notices and orders per building. May it be from a Rent Safe TO evaluation perspective or from an MLS investigations perspective, the city data does not appear to support the proposition that there is widespread issues of neglect and poorly maintained multi-residential apartment buildings in the city of Toronto. I have many, many more charts to look at, so I've given you what I thought today are the highlighted ones, but here's some kind of key reflections on my analysis of the RentSafe program data and what it tells us. With more than half of the RentSafe TO program buildings having an evaluation score of 76 or better, it is clear that a significant portion of apartment buildings in the City of Toronto more than meet the base property standards. Contrary to what is being said in media and by some political stakeholders, on whole, the private sector multi-res industry is more than meeting the challenge of ensuring the city's aging rental stock is being maintained and residents are being provided with acceptable living conditions that more than meet base standards. While much noise and media claims are being made about the poor state of condition and maintenance data of the city's high-rise apartment structures owned and managed by the private sector, the data just does not support it. Private sector high-rise buildings scored on average over 80%. Conversely, though, the data does show low-rise buildings and TCH buildings tend to have the lowest average evaluation score. Observation 3. As we've shown, RentSafe evaluation scores consistently average 71 and 72 for private sector buildings owned and built prior to 1940. This would seemingly indicate that significant investment has gone into maintaining and updating many of these buildings over the years to ensure they meet current standards and are being properly maintained. Conversely, TCHC scores average between 63 and 68% for even newer buildings built between 1940 and 1960. Number 4. When we compare RentSafe DO data with the city's MLS database, we seemingly find that only 17% of the investigation notices in order actually relate to RentSafe building. If the city is looking to fix a problem, perhaps it should focus RentSafe TO on the housing segment where the problems really lie. Observation 5. There's no question there are some buildings that appear to be poorly maintained and that do not meet by bylaw and property standards requirements. Prior to the creation of the RentSafe TO program, both the GTA and FRPO stated strenuously that the city and the industry were already aware of the 1% of poorly maintained buildings, and that significant effort should be taken by the city to bring these buildings into compliance with property standards. However, the data reflects that many RentSafe TO buildings that score under 50 are the same 35 buildings identified by MLS under the city's old MRAP program. You have to ask yourself, what real difference, if any, has the RentSafe TO program made? Observation number 6. After 4 years of RentSafe TO and given the marginal increase in improvement of scores, all stakeholders should be questioning the value and need for this program. FRPO has long agreed with the city to throw the book at the few bad performers in the industry. But the city's own data clearly shows was not necessary, nor is it necessary to continue to create a RentSafe TO program that seemingly has little or no impact. On a final note, as other municipalities seek to establish rent-safe programs in their cities and towns, they should ask themselves, what will the data tell them 5 years from now? Are they trying to fix a problem that does not really exist across their landlord constituents? Are they focused on dealing with a few bad performers? Are they working in partnership with the industry and all stakeholders in creating a healthy, affordable housing environment? Over-regulation of any industry just pits one stakeholder against other stakeholders and clearly stymies growth and productivity. Never better evidenced than in the City of Toronto and with its RentSafe program. My final comment, if license is being spoken about in your municipality, then take heed and contact your mayor and city councillor and ask them to carefully examine their data for their communities and implore them not to make the same results or same mistakes. That ends my presentation. John, many thank you for my slides, and I'll hand it over to you, sir.
Thanks, Ted. In the time that's remaining, I just wanted to give you a quick update on some of the background of the political climate that is going to influence what we should look ahead to over the course of the next year and a half or so, as we think about how it could affect potentially the rental market and the operation of buildings, and climate for building new ones. A quick observation about the budget from 2021, because it was really a window into what the provincial government is going to look like for the next year and a half. More than most budgets, it had a laser focus on two areas of activity. The first was, of course, unsurprisingly, managing the pandemic. And so significant focus, significant investments, and frankly, all the things that you'd want them to be working on, with major investments in vaccines and hospital infrastructure, new hospital beds, mental health and addictions, and attracting and training new PSWs. So that real clear focus displaced pretty much any other kind of significant investment or any other kind of significant approach to any other areas, other than the second main area of focus, which is the economic recovery. The government made it very clear that not so much that it had a plan, but that it had a plan to have a plan. And I think that's really important because they've begun a consultation process as to how to restart the economy after COVID. There's obviously some clear areas of concern. I think we're all worried about the effect on the hospitality industry, on Main Street commercial, on retail more generally. Certainly the travel industry, but more broadly, they've got to focus on trying to make sure that we have the fundamentals in place that can allow growth to get going again. And there's no way that the residential construction side of things can't be a part of that. And it's clear that it doesn't really matter what community you're talking about in Ontario. There is a significant focus on all aspects of housing supply, but particularly on the affordable and attainable end of things. And so clearly that puts a big focus on rental. So I think you can look for extraordinarily focused governments as it comes to the spending initiatives and what its core themes are going to be for delivering in the next couple of years. There's another interesting point here, which is had nothing happened, we would have been on track to have a deficit of, say, give or take 8 billion or so in this year. Instead, because of the extraordinary spending that had to go on to manage COVID, and also as a result of the extraordinary decline in revenue, we have a deficit that's more like on the order of $38.5 billion. And in the 2021-2022, it's still going to be sitting in the 30s. That's going to wind up having a significant impact, again, on the flexibility of government to operate as it's moving ahead. But it's interesting, and if you take a look at the overall building blocks of the budget plan, you can see there's basically 5 components to it. It's to complete the management of COVID and phase out COVID spending. It's to restore the revenue hole by restarting the economy. It's to allow continued upward pressure in the base, which of course is going to lead to a significant growth in revenue, they're hoping. It's to rely on continued low interest rates, and it's to lobby for increased federal transfers. So the bottom line is they're going to be very constrained, And I think we should expect to see, while there'll be some focus on the restart, it's going to be quite limited in terms of what they're going to be able to deliver from that constraint perspective. The other important thing to understand is, government cycles, they last for 4 years. We're coming right to the end of this government's term. They're already moving into their pre-election planning. But perhaps even more interesting, we're going to have a round of elections, a federal election cycle that could be as early as, triggered as early as end of April, but is widely expected to happen before September. We could wind up having a provincial election cycle then that'll follow right after that with a fixed election date of June in 2022. And hard on the heels of that, we're going to have a municipal election cycle. So what that means is there's going to be a considerable amount of fog in the process as 3 successive governments go after 3 successive sets of elections. And the last point I'd make on that is FRPO members and the sector in general is always at its greatest risk as it comes into election time, because elections tend to make bad policy. If there's any one message to take away from all the numbers that Ted quoted at you, it's that good policy and good politics don't always mix. And as a result, you really have to make certain that we don't give them any fuel to want to do dumb things. The greatest focus that we have in the work that we do is trying to create the conditions for positive things to happen, but also trying to keep the conditions where bad things don't happen. And I think everybody who's followed the industry understands the risks that happen when governments are bad facts in the media force governments to take radical action. So you can be sure that Tony and the team will continue to work on this and that we'll be there to help them as we go through this challenging time. Tony, back to you.
Okay. Thank you, John, for that presentation. And so just as we are about to close, just one last slide that John sort of covered a little bit in his comments, and that just speaks to sort of the public relations challenges. So not a lot really to add to what John said. It is something that we are always thinking about. We know that decisions can get made based on a few bad stories, so we continue to do our best to, I think, conduct ourselves and manage issues in the best way that we can, and know that we represent a sector who is very much concerned about that as well. The pandemic has added a lot of stress and strain to everyone, but certainly we will continue to sort of, I think, monitor sort of activities as best we can and continue to, I think, just, promote and encourage our sector to continue to do the very best work that it does day in and day out. And so as we bring the session to a close at SpringFest, FRPO's industry update can bring everyone back on, I think. Want to just thank all of my colleagues who have presented and joined me here today. Colleagues from FRPO again, Asquith Allen, Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs, Ted Whitehead, Director of Certification, and our colleague from Strategy Corp, John Matheson, who is a principal and general counsel and a government relations consultant extraordinaire to FRPO. Thank you so much to all 3 of you and to all of you for joining us today. We're very we hope you enjoyed the content of our presentation. Be well, be safe, and thanks again. Bye for now.